Okay, let's see what the next program is. So this is Programming Challenge 6-2, your hospital charges. Create an app that calculates the total cost of the hospital stay. The application should accept the following input: number of days, so that's number of days, amount of medication charges, amount of surgical charges, amount of lab fees, and amount of physical rehabilitation fees. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's 5 labels and 5 text fields that you want to accept input into. The hospital charges $350 per day, so that's a constant or a variable value. And the application form should resemble the one in figure 623, which is here. Okay. And you should have these functions: calculate stay charges, calculate miscellaneous charges, calculate total charges, and validate the input fields. Okay. So let's see what I did. This is the one we just were working on. So we'll close that one up. We'll open up another instance of Visual Basic here. And that's kind of the cool thing about Visual Basic. You can open up multiple instances of Visual Basic, and they're running. You can run different programs in each instance of them. So this is our hospital charges one here. It's morning. Okay. Double click on Form 1. There we go. Ooh. So we got form hospital chart. What did I even call this thing? Make it smaller here. Move it over. And I called this hospital charges. All right. Okay, cool. Hospital charges up here. Length of stay, medication. These are all labels. So I just made the first label and then copied them. And then changed the information, the properties of each. So this one is probably meds or medication. I don't know. LEL meds. Oh, LEL medication. All right. Yeah, that's cool. Surgical charges. LEL surgical charges. Okay. So then you know what? I probably can take that out. I always do that. I always put something when I have 2 labels here. So this is a panel right here. And if you remember anything you put on a panel, it acts like it's grouped together. So this is just the total cost. And then I call this one LBL total because this is the one where I wanted to put the actual total of these up here into here. So I left it to say total so I could see where it was before changing it. And then there's our exit button, our clear button, and our calculate button. So let's go ahead and run it. So our stay, let's say we stayed 3 days. So that would be 3 times 3. So that should be, was that 1150? 3 times 3 is 9. That's 1050. That's what that should be. So medication. Oops, turn my dumb lock on. Say that's 100. Surgical charges, let's say it's 100 for that. Our lab fees were 50. Our physical rehabilitation was 500. And that totals to 1,800. Okay, that's cool. Anyway, 1,300 for those. Say we didn't have any medication. Ooh, and we didn't have any surgery. Look at that. Oh. And then we didn't have any lab fees. Take those out. So what happens if we put in a negative lab fee here? So let's just say negative 50. Calculate. Oh, lab fees can't be negative. All right. So let's clear. So anyway, let's see what I did here. You know what? Well, let's take that out too, because that doesn't need to be in there. We're going to take this out first. So I'm going to just make it empty. And by doing that, you can't really see where it is. Even when you click on it, you can't really see where it is. Oh, whoops, we need to do that. So get rid of that. So we'll go back to the form here. And let's go back to our calculate button. Yeah, let's look at the clear button first. This is the close button, obviously. And this is our clear button. We cleared all the text fields, and then we set the result label, the total label, to empty. And then originally I put this up here as a constant because remember the charges were $300 a day, but I commented it out because I didn't need it there. So anyway, let's go back to our button. This is our calculate button. So this is the validate the input fields to make sure everything is okay in the input field. So, and what we couldn't do is we had to make it so it won't accept negative numbers. It won't accept negative values. The integer field had to be positive. And I think it couldn't be blank either. Yeah, they couldn't be blank. That was the other one. What was the third one? Let me go back and look at that really quick. Do not accept negative value for length of stay and negative value for all the rest of them. So you can't have a negative value for any of them. So yeah, we did that. So that means you have to do a message box for each one of these things if there's nothing in them or if they're negative value, which is I liked the way I showed you in the last video more than this way. This is kind of like, I call this the long version of what I showed you in the last video. Anyway, yeah. So validate input fields is a function that we use. I'll show you that in a few minutes. But the first thing I had to do is I had to validate, like I added this in at the end. So like we'll talk about this later after we talk about what happened in the program first. So the first one, we have to accept the input values for the number of days, and then the decimal values for the medication, and same medication or for the lab fees, surgical costs, the rehabilitation cost, and our grand total for our total in our label. And then this is the actual calculate for the total. And I commented out, this is used in the function, but this is just how it's used. So it's the number of days multiplied by 350, which we're not even using this in this one, but then we add in the cost of the medications, cost of the lab fees, the cost of the surgery, and the cost of the rehabilitation charges. And then the daily cost is decimal, which is the daily charges of the hospital charges, and the lab fees, rehab cost. And obviously I didn't use them because these ones are all highlighted out. That's all right. It doesn't really matter. And the daily cost. So we did use this up here. And this is the cost per day, which we calculated the stay charges of the number of days in the hospital. And this is calc stay charges. So let's see what we did there. Function, calc stay charges, calculate the stay, how long you stay. So we sent the variable by value of int num days as an integer. Made it all as an integer because you have to send it as an object. And that's all that really means, is you're sending an object as that kind of object. So that's being sent an object as an integer, and it's expecting to get an integer too. So then we're just returning the value of the number of days that was sent to us, multiplied by 350, which is the variable, the per day, num days per day. And we sent it back. So that's our first function there. Let me end the function. So that was up here. So then the next thing we need to do is we need to calculate the miscellaneous costs, which are, we send it the meds, the lab fees, the surgical costs, and the rehab costs. So those are our arguments. So those are our variables as well that we're sending to it. And that is the second one here. Calculate miscellaneous charges by value from the variable meds as a decimal, by value lab fees as a decimal. Same for surgery. And here, this is the thing, that you can still use the space underscore to go to the next line, which is what I did here. And then the space underscore disappears, but it's still there. And you're just coding on the next line. So I could have done a space underscore right there, and it would have done this on the next line anyway. So then what we're returning is returning the meds plus the lab fees plus the surgical costs plus the rehabilitation costs as the miscellaneous charges. So that was, and then we call that the miscellaneous charges here. And then the total costs, calculate total costs. So we're taking the miscellaneous charges here that we just went and figured out and sent back here. And we're taking the daily cost, what we figured out here, and the number of days times 350 to our daily cost to calculate our total charges, which would be the same thing here. By value, we sent the decimal daily cost as a decimal, miscellaneous costs as a decimal, and then we sent the whole thing because we're as a decimal, because that's the kind of object we sent to it. And then we return the daily cost plus the miscellaneous cost in the function there. So that's that. And then finally, after all that, we display in the label, our text label, our total cost, change it to a string, and then we change it to currency. So let's go ahead and run that before we go into the validate function. Because that all those are what you need to do before you actually get to the validate function. So let's go, let's say it's 10 days. So that should be $3,500. We got 0, 0, 0. Whoops. So that should be $3,510 and $35. So that's it. So anyway, let's go back. And so that was everything. So the last thing we're doing is the if validate function, because this is where you're checking the values in the text boxes. So how I programmed this was all of this stuff I programmed up here, from here down to here before I even got to the validate inputs. Because on the validate inputs, I put that all in the if statement. The very last thing I did was the validation of the input fields. So how I did that was in a function. I just made it a Boolean, so that's a true or false value. So I did the try parse first as an integer of the days, and I only needed this for the first text box to value because that was the only one I declared as an integer. All the rest of them are decimals, so I did that for the decimals. And so we did the if text try days is blank, then message box, you must show the number of days as a positive integer. Input error. And then it returns it as false. So if it returns it as false, then it pops up the text box and returns the Boolean label as false. So all these have to be true before it goes through them. So else if try parse in text days and this is the try parse the in text days, so that's the variable that we're using there. Then message box. So if this not an integer, then you must enter a positive integer, and it returns false. You remember when in the last program I programmed it as ASCII key characters, and I think that probably would have been a better way to go about it. I mean, this works just as well, but this is kind of a longer version. The programming challenge asked for this version of it, and I think they just wanted to make sure that we could do that. But this is definitely the longer version of it. So else, so if it's an integer in the text box, but it's less than 0, then show an input error. The number entered cannot be a negative number. Return false. So, and then you just end it. So that's for the integer text box. And you have to do this for each text box too. So then we did the same thing for the validate meds. Then you change the message. If it's blank, you must enter the cost of a medication as a decimal. I showed how the format is here. And then this is important. You need to put the not, if it's not a decimal. If it's not decimal, try parse. So that would be if it's not input at all as a decimal. So if it doesn't parse as a decimal and it's not a decimal, then the medication cost must be input as with decimal numbers. So it's either 0 or 0.00. You can do it. So that's for that one. Else, if the medication is a decimal and it's less than 0, then input error, medication cost cannot be negative. So you see how we changed the messages in the message box here? And we did the same thing for the lab fees. That's blank lab fees. The lab fee cannot be blank. If it's not, see, and then you can't just put if decimal dot try parse, because you want to see if it's not a decimal, then try parse. Then the lab fees cannot be must be entered in as a decimal. Else, if it is, and it's less than 0, then the lab fees can't be negative. You see this is looking very similar. They're doing the same exact thing. Every single one of them. And then we got the surgical costs here. Let me put a little comment in on this one. So surgical fees, so that's blank in the text box. If it's not a decimal, try parse, and it's not a decimal, then input error, the surgical fees must be entered as a decimal format. Else, if it is entered as a decimal format and it's less than 0, then they can't be negative. Return it false again, end if on all of it. So we'd do the same thing for the rehab fees. And if it's blank, the rehab fees can't be blank. Else, if not a decimal and try to parse as text, this isn't a decimal, then you must enter the rehab fees as a decimal number. So else, if it is less than 0, then the rehab fees can't be negative. If all of them were correct, if all those if statements that we did for each text box were correct, then return true. So if all this information in this function from here down to down to here, if all that's correct, then it returns true into the value. So if it returns true into and that's the Boolean value up here, the value input fields. So if it returns true, then it goes back up here. If this is true, if this evaluates to true, that function we just went through, then do this. So if you click on the button and it goes through the function of validating the fields, and they all come back true, then this is all the code that you do after that. And then it finally ends in calculate the totals and displaying the total right there. And then that's the end of it. So to see that, do that. So if we enter a negative number in 1, so then all the rest of it's correct. We get an input error. The number can't be negative. So that was for the first one. Say, okay. So we'll change that to 5 days. And let's say our medication costs are negative 50. And you see medication costs can't be negative. All right, that's cool. We'll make them 50. Say we made our surgical costs negative. Surgical fees can't be negative. Okay. Make those 500 again. Say our lab fees are negative. Lab fees can't be negative. All right. And let's say rehab costs are negative. And our rehab fees can't be negative. Okay. So what happens if they're blank? Rehab cost is a decimal. It must be entered as a decimal number. Okay, that's cool. Surgical costs are blank. Whoa. Can't be blank. So that works. And if you do that for every single one, those three if statements for every single one of those text boxes, then it comes out correctly. So rehab fees cannot be negative. Oh, I got the rehab fees negative still. Whoops, I forgot about that. See, there we go. And it works. So anyway, let's take a look at that again. So if the validate fields is true, then do all this stuff. Down to there. And here's our functions here. Those are our first three functions we need to calculate for the label. And I did all those before I put in the if statement for the validate the input fields. And then the last function, validate input fields as a Boolean. Declared a couple variables for that. Then we did three validate statements for each text box. And we put them all in if statements. This would be the second one. It's the third one. It's the surgical fourth one. And finally, our rehabilitation costs. And if all those are okay, then we return value of true, which makes it true up top. Anyway, that is programming challenge. What did it say? 6-2, calculate hospital charges. All right, thanks for watching.